Hello, scholars. I wanted to go, since you're reading in the New Testament now, so that you're familiar with some of the groups that were around during the time of Jesus. And you'll hear them spoken of at different times: scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, the Samaritans. And I just want to give you a little background of each of them so that you're familiar when you're hearing a little bit more than just a passing word. The first are the Pharisees. These are probably the ones who are closest in a belief system with Jesus. The Pharisees believe in God, angels, and spirits. They believe in providence. They believe in prayer, the necessity of faith and good works, the last judgment. They're waiting for the Messiah. They believe in heaven and the immortality of the soul. They were strong followers of the law, both written and oral. So what the written law is the first five books of the Bible given to us by Moses. They also believe that the oral law, which is the prophets and the oral tradition of the Jewish rabbis, that is of equal weight. We'll find in a second the Sadducees only believe in the authority of the first five books of the Bible. These guys believed in the first five books of the Bible and that it had authority, but they thought it was subject to interpretation. Understanding that, they believed there were 613 commandments that one had to follow. We have the 10 commandments. They had the 613 commandments. And what they would do is they would ask questions, the rabbis, of what did it mean to keep holy the Sabbath? And you'll get laws like can't pick up anything more than that weighs than a fig leaf. And the Pharisees asserted that God could and should be worshipped even away from the temple outside of Jerusalem. To the Pharisees, worship consisted not of bloody sacrifices, the practice of the temple priest, but in prayer and in studying of God's law. They wanted the Romans out of Israel. They didn't want to have anything to do with the Romans. They thought that the Romans were impure. The scribes, sometimes they're associated with the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees, and there was an overlap. Both of these groups wanted to deal with the law. The scribes had knowledge of the law and could draft legal documents, such as contracts for marriage, divorce, loans, inheritance, mortgages, the sale of land. Every village had at least one scribe. Because of their emphasis of the law, probably some of these were Pharisees. However, most Pharisees were small landowners and traders and not professional scribes. Next, there's the Sadducees. These, this group of people rejected everything supernatural. They did not believe in heaven. They did not believe in hell. They did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe in angels or demons. To their way of thinking, when somebody died, so did their soul. So how did these people believe that God rewarded somebody who kept the law? Well, they believed that God gave them a long life and made them wealthy, lots of sons. Those were the three ways God blessed, not an afterlife. The Sadducees maintained the only way for a truly pious life was to live according to the commandments in the written law. The Pharisees, on the other hand, taught that the written law had been given to the Jews and they had a right and were free to interpret the law. The Sadducees wielded power in nearly every aspect of Jewish life. They sided with the Romans and adopted many, that should be many, of Roman customs. They were known as Hellenists. They believed strongly in ritual purity as prescribed by Moses. They didn't want anything to disqualify them from leading the temple services that generated income. So you'll read about the Good Samaritan. We'll get to in a second what a Samaritan is. But the first person who passes up the Good Samaritan, the man who had been beaten in the story of the Good Samaritan, was a priest. And this would be why. They didn't want anything to disqualify them. They didn't want to be impure, as prescribed by Moses. So they wouldn't be able to touch a person who had died, or they would have to go through a week-long purification process. These men hated Jesus and were the Jewish aristocrats of their day, known more for their wealth and corruption than for any religious devotion. Sadducees controlled the two most important institutions of Jewish society, the Jerusalem Temple and the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin actually met inside the temple where Jesus was condemned. The Sanhedrin was the governing body for both religious and legal issues for the Jews. The leader was the high priest and was almost always a Sadducee. The main differences you'll see between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees embraced the law. The Sadducees embraced sacrifice in the temple. The Pharisees' interpretation of the law. For the Sadducees, it was the Torah alone. The Pharisees are basically middle-class people and poor landowners. The Sadducees are upper class. They were the wealthy. That's why they sided with the Romans when the Romans took over to try and keep their wealth so it wasn't taken away. The Pharisees believe in the resurrection of the dead. Sadducees, no resurrection. They believed in an afterlife, the Pharisees, no afterlife for the Sadducees. See, they didn't believe in an afterlife, so they were Sadducees. Easy way to remember. They were rejected by the Jewish leaders, most of them Sadducees, and these guys supported the Jewish leaders. Even King Herod, who was a Hellenist, sided with the Romans. Another group is the Zealots. The Zealots were a political movement during the time of Christ, there's that M again, which sought to incite the people to rebel against the Roman Empire and expel it from the Holy Land by force of arms, by any means necessary. Now, they don't have a big army, but they are looking for a leader. Two of Jesus' apostles were zealots. Judas, who ended up betraying him, Judas Iscariot, and Simon the Zealot were both zealots. They despised even Jews who sought peace and conciliation with Roman authorities. Next are the Samaritans. You heard about the Good Samaritan. Jesus told this story that the Samaritan was the good person in the story, but basically all the groups we studied so far were, all of them unilaterally hate the Samaritans. The Samaritans were half Jewish and half Gentiles, so they intermarried with Assyrians during the Assyrian captivity. So the 10 tribes, northern tribes, they were captured by the Assyrians. The two lower tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were not captured, and that was the Jews of the time of Jesus. Certain people from the nation of Israel stayed behind after the captivity. These people intermarried with the Assyrians, producing the Samaritans. They didn't worship on Mount Zion. They were in Jerusalem, but worshipped on Mount Gerizim. They were looked at as heretics and half-breeds. I've heard it described that they would be like voodoo in Catholicism. Some of it looked like Catholicism, but it didn't mean the same thing even when they were doing the same thing. So these are your groups that came during the time, that existed during the time of Jesus, and that you'll read about.